everyone, welcome back to my channel. So last week we spoke about Dennis Nilsson, and if you haven't seen that, as usual, it is up here. And if you are new, welcome. On Sundays we just talk about a true crime story that is either South African or internationally based. But today we are actually taking off and heading to America to talk about Barbara Daly, or Barbara Backland if you know her better that way. But if you would like to hear about what happened to her or why she is famous, then let's get into it.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Barbara Daly was born in Massachusetts in Cambridge on September 28, 1921, and she had one brother. Her mom's name was Nina and her dad's name was Frank. But sadly, when Barbara was 11 years old, the first bit of tragedy hit her family, and her father committed suicide in the garage, and this was by carbon monoxide poisoning. And after everything kind of settled, Nina, who was Barbara's mom, they moved her brother, who was named Frank Jr., and Barbara to New York. And when Frank, Barbara's father, passed away, the family received quite a lot of life insurance money, and both Barbara and Frank Jr. received $60,000 each back in the 1930s, and that was a lot of money back then. But now that Barbara and Frank and Nina were living in this hotel, Barbara was busy walking down the road in New York City, and a random man stopped Barbara and said that she was one of the top 10 most beautiful girls that he had ever seen in New York. And Barbara didn't know that this man who actually stopped her was a very, very famous illustrator at the time. And this man, he promised to take photos of Barbara, he promised to put her name in light. And I guess if we had to fast forward now to 2020, I think it would be a bit weird for a man to stop a young girl on the side and be like, you're really pretty. We would be like, no thank you, sir. But I guess back then people trusted a bit more, and he didn't have any ill intention. And he did actually end up doing an illustration of Barbara and put her photo up in Club 21, where she did become quite famous for a little bit. Barbara was now becoming a little bit famous. Her and her mother did end up going to Hollywood, but Barbara really didn't like Hollywood. So after a little while of staying there, they did end up moving back to New York. And because the place in Hollywood, the hotel, was becoming too expensive, they did end up renting a place in Park Avenue, which may have been a smarter move anyway, because the years of living in that hotel were becoming very expensive. By the time that Barbara and Nina had moved into Park Avenue, Frank Jr., who was Barbara's brother, was actually a young adult at the time, and he was married with 2 children. But sadly, tragedy struck the family again when Frank Jr., Barbara's brother, ended up dying in a car accident. And after mourning her brother for quite a while, she did eventually end up dating, and she started dating a man named John Jacob Astor. John was married at the time, but John was really, really smitten by Barbara, and he offered her $3 million at the time to wait for him until he divorced his wife. And at the time, Barbara did wait for him. And I'm not sure if she got the money off of John, but she ended up waiting for him until she met another man. And this man was named Brooks Bakerland. Brooks Bakerland came from a very, very rich and wealthy family. His grandfather actually created some kind of plastic, which we know of today. But Brooks's dad, which was named George, really wanted him to follow in his grandfather's footsteps to become some kind of engineer, something like that. But Brooks did not want to go into that line at all. He wanted to become a writer. And Brooks's dad, George, really hated this. He didn't want Brooks to go down that kind of line. But he did go to college for a little while to study. He did end up dropping out to become a writer. And during the time that he was trying to be a writer, he did end up enrolling in the Royal Canadian Air Force, where he was training to be a pilot. And when Brooks did not have to be training, or he didn't have to practice flying, then he would kind of be on leave. And when he was on leave, the one day his sister called that he must come and visit her and stay with her for a little bit. And Brooks's sister was very good friends with Barbara because they met while acting. So Brooks' sister said, come over to my house, I have a pretty girl which I would love for you to meet, which was Barbara. And the reason why Brooks was interested is because his sister said that this girl, this very pretty girl that he wanted to meet, was a poet. And remember, Brooks really loved writing. So it was said that Brooks and Barbara hit it off instantly. They were very, very physically attracted to each other, and also they were both good looking and rich. So remember that I said Barbara claimed that she was a poet? Well, Brooks actually called her out on this because he said that she lacked words or creativity at all. So they had a very tumultuous relationship in the beginning. They were constantly fighting, and he was just constantly calling her out on little things like that. But they were still very, very physically attracted to each other, which kind of made them stay together. And when Brooks had to go back to South Carolina, continue to train to be in the Air Force, Barbara called Brooks to tell him that she thought that she was pregnant. And Brooks, being the gentleman, ended up marrying her. And during their marriage, Barbara kind of didn't grow at all. She had no baby bump, and Brooks eventually figured out that she was not pregnant, but they did stay together. And while Brooks and Barbara were living in South Carolina, they really, really partied it up. They were living a fully socialite life. They were going out to parties, they were drinking, they were having people over for dinner almost every night. But what Barbara didn't tell Brooks when they first started to kind of court or start with their relationship was that she really suffered with her mental health quite badly. And she was actually a patient of the New York psychologist, Dr. Kennedy. And obviously, medical records are private, but what Dr. Kennedy did release was that he said that Barbara should never ever have children. And why he said that, we don't know. But obviously, her mental health must be quite unstable if he recommended that she never have kids. So I'm not sure if it was part of their toxic relationship or they both had mental health issues. But one day, Brooks was only joking at a dinner party, and he said that the next girl to walk into the door at a restaurant, if they gave him $1 million, he would sleep with her while Barbara was sitting next to him. And Barbara obviously got really, really upset, and it was said that don't ever mess with Barbara when she's upset. So after everyone left the dinner, then they walked out of the restaurant. So while they were on the street, Barbara and Brooks kind of went at it. And Barbara said to Brooks, you know what, I didn't like that. And the next guy to drive past, I will go with them and sleep with them. So just so happened that 4 men then rolled up in a car. Barbara got into the car and drove off with them and came back to the apartment hours later. And when Barbara returned and Brooks, asked what happened, she just said that nothing happened. But remember, it was hours afterwards, so we don't know what happened, but she said nothing happened. So Barbara and Brooks did end up having a child together, and his name was Anthony, and he was born in 1946. And I'm not sure if Barbara wasn't ready to have kids or she just didn't want to give up the life that she was accustomed to, but Barbara literally didn't give up anything that she was doing before. She went out partying, she went out drinking, and she was constantly having people over for dinner just like normal. And she would constantly travel the world, even with little baby Anthony, but eventually they did settle down in 1960, and that was in France. But not all is happy. Brooks did end up having a lot of affairs, and every time that he had an affair, he would threaten to leave Barbara, and Barbara would get very, very upset. She would either be very, very angry, or she would try and commit suicide, and Brooks would end up feeling really guilty, and he would stay with Barbara. Then, kind of going back to Anthony, while he was growing up, his parents really didn't spend much time with him. Barbara hardly ever spent any time with him, and the only time that she did want to see him was when he was playing a musical instrument or he was busy painting. And it was said that Barbara and Brooks really wanted Anthony to be kind of a little prodigy and to be the best artist either in music or anything. Barbara would just leave Anthony with the maid, and then she would only want to see him once they had practiced something so that she could see and brag about his talents. According to the research that I saw, the only time Brooks would spend with Anthony was when they would go out on hikes or when he would try and show Anthony something that was biology based. So he would try and teach Anthony the Latin names for animals and plants, and that was kind of the only time that they spent together. Otherwise, he would just be left alone to his own devices. And people would also say that he was very, very thin because Barbara liked the lean and slim look. So he would kind of be very hungry a lot of the time. And the friends that Barbara and Brooks kept when they went away to Italy or they went away to other places in Europe, they would say that Anthony would sit by himself most of the time and he would kind of pull the legs of animals. So if they were at the beach, he would pull the legs of crabs, flies, anything that he could detach limbs of, that's what he would do. And while Anthony was growing up, especially when he was just becoming a teenager, he did realize that he was probably gay. It is unclear whether he was bisexual or if he was gay. But Anthony did end up telling his dad, and his dad completely disowned him. He didn't want to hear about it and he completely rejected him. And when Anthony eventually became a teenager, Brooks actually never referred to Anthony again as his son. He always referred to him as Barbara's son. And it was also said that when Anthony was now a teenager, his parents would leave and go to Europe and go on their holidays, and they would leave him alone at the New York apartment or in the French apartment, wherever they were staying, they would leave him. And Anthony would go out and he would find men or boys a little bit older than him, and they would bring him home so that they could engage in sexual activity with each other. But when Barbara found out that Anthony was gay, this kind of rocked her world. She was in so much denial about it. She didn't want to hear about it. She didn't believe it, and she wouldn't accept it at all. And during this time as well, I remember Brooks was still having affairs. He was continuously having affairs. and his mom was self-harming all the time. So this was a very tumultuous time for Anthony. He was going through a lot, and his mother and father were constantly going at it. She was self-harming, so it was a very hectic time for Anthony. But then in 1967, Barbara and Brooks did end up separating, but they wanted to go on their last proper holiday as a couple, and they went to a resort in Spain, and Anthony actually met a man named Jake Cooper. And Jake Cooper was a little bit strange. He was said to constantly be followed around by a lot of hippies, and I don't know if it was just because it was the 1960s and if there was a lot of drugs involved, but Jake would often have bones sewn into his clothes, and it was said that he was part of a cult because the people who followed him and worshipped him believed that he could actually and truly produce black magic, and that he had saved people's lives, he had murdered people all from his black magic. So I don't know what was happening there, but Jake was seen as the all-powerful. And Anthony was kind of obsessed with Jake. He was so enamored by this different type of lifestyle, this freer lifestyle, and he would want to go wherever Jake went. But when Anthony was around 21 years old, his friends and family friends became very worried, and they actually called Barbara, who was living in Switzerland at the time, and she then flew over to where Anthony was staying, and she collected him and said, "Listen, Anthony, you're coming home with me." But Anthony didn't have a passport. So when Barbara and Anthony got to the airport, she had an absolute hissy fit. She spat and kicked at the immigration officials, and they were actually arrested and put in handcuffs. But eventually, money talks, so Anthony and Barbara were released. But then later on, Anthony did end up meeting a French lady named Sylvie, and Barbara was very happy by this, not only because Anthony was now involved with a female, but when Sylvie invited Anthony and Barbara over to like a family dinner, Barbara kept on telling Sylvie, "You need to marry Anthony. He's rich. I want grandbabies." Like, they just kind of started dating. So I think Sylvie was a bit put off by all of this. Barbara kept on inviting Sylvie over to the house. And it's not funny, but Sylvie actually ended up falling for Brooke, Anthony's dad, because Brooks was back in the city and living in the same house. And Brooks and Sylvie started openly having an affair and kind of sleeping with each other. And remember, Brooks and Barbara were still technically married. They hadn't gotten divorced yet. So this really, really made Barbara furious. Then Barbara, as her normal tactic, tried to commit suicide. She took a lot of pills, didn't end up working. But then Sylvie thought, you know what, I'm not going to let you get my man. So she did the same thing. And Brooks had to kind of figure out who he wanted, and he did end up going with Sylvie, and he officially asked for a divorce from Barbara. So Barbara thought that she only had one more attempt to save her relationship with Brooks. So she thought that in her head, how she would save this marriage, she would bring a whole lot of different women as often as she could to try and sleep with Anthony, to try and convert him back. But this didn't end up working. So because the woman that she was paying to sleep with Anthony didn't help his situation, she decided that she was going to cure him by sleeping with him. Barbara believed that she was very pretty, which she was. She was very rich, which she was. And that she was the best in bed, which I don't know. But Barbara now believed that those three were the reason that she could cure him. Besides Barbara wanting to sleep with her son Anthony, they had a very strange relationship. Barbara would often take photos of Anthony in weird positions. Often when Anthony was trying to bath, she would kind of follow him in the bathroom and take photos of him. She would also get undressed in front of her son and sleep next to her son, which I guess isn't that weird, but taking photos of her son when he's an adult/teenager is pretty weird. And to top it off, she would kind of frame the photos and put it in the lounge. Okay, so let's just take a step back for a sec. So firstly, imagine how Anthony must have felt. He was going through a very confusing time back in the 60s and 70s. I don't know, or I doubt that being openly gay was very accepted. So he was constantly never being accepted by anybody. And then his mother now forcing women and forcing herself on him. So now Sylvie and his dad have moved out of the house officially. But now the summer had come and his father and Sylvie had moved back to France or wherever they were sleeping for the summer, and Barbara and Anthony were in the same place at the same time. So not only had Anthony gone through all of this with his mom, but now he is seeing his dad and the girl that he actually liked married. This is why I'm not sure if Anthony was bisexual, because he really had feelings for Sylvie, and he may have just loved people, and whoever the people were, that was who he liked. So, but also seeing your dad and the girl that you actually like together must have been awful for Anthony to have to witness. After the summer had gone, Anthony's mental health really started to deteriorate. When Anthony would go to art classes that his mother would pay for, it was said that his teacher would ask him to draw a bowl of fruit, but he would end up drawing people being dismembered and murdered in his art. And also when Barbara had guests over for dinner, he would kind of walk around the house naked and walk around the guests naked. And this might be acceptable if he was a child, but he was a full-grown adult at the time. And he did end up confiding in a friend to say that his mother keeps wanting to sleep with him, or she did sleep with him, and he doesn't know what to do. And I think that at this time, Anthony must have felt so helpless because no one was helping him. His friend didn't do anything about it. And Barbara was still constantly taking photos of Anthony naked. Whenever he went to the beach, she would tell him to take his clothes off, and they would take photos of him, or she would take photos of him. And in the house, she would take photos of him. It was just constantly weird. So Anthony couldn't escape what was happening because his photos were everywhere. But eventually Anthony started to become violent towards his mother and very aggressive. And at one point he did end up beating Barbara so badly that she became unconscious. And because of this, Barbara did end up putting Anthony in an institution, and he only ended up staying there for 6 weeks because Barbara said that she could no longer afford to keep Anthony there. And Brooks didn't believe in therapy, so he wouldn't pay for Anthony's institutions either. And he thought that Anthony was just evil, he wasn't sick. But after being let out of the hospital, Anthony was still very aggressive towards his mother. And Barbara did end up taking him to the doctor, where he was diagnosed as schizophrenic. And the doctors did recommend that he be hospitalized at a private institution so that he could get the help that he needed. But Barbara said once again she couldn't afford this, so he was sent back home and continued to beat and threaten Barbara. And during this time, Barbara and Anthony did end up moving to London, and this is where the violence really escalated. Anthony was said to have tried to blind Barbara by sticking a pencil through her eye. And in July 1972, when Anthony and Barbara were taking a walk down the street where they lived, Anthony actually tried to push Barbara into moving traffic in order to kill her. Coincidentally, police were walking past and they did end up arresting Anthony, but no charges were laid against him because Barbara didn't want to lay charges against her son. But round about near November, the end of the year of 1972, Anthony stopped communicating. He was constantly rocking, and Barbara was worried about this, so she did end up taking him back to a psychiatric hospital. And the psychiatrist who was evaluating Anthony did say to Barbara, you actually need to leave because he might end up killing you. And she was like, oh no, he's not going to do anything to me, which he had already done. But the psychiatrist did end up calling police and asking police to stay near Barbara and around the house so that they could watch her. But the police declined this because they said that there was no crime that was actually committed, so there was nothing that they could do. Then on November 15th, 1972, Anthony, Barbara, and the psychiatrist agreed that the Monday Anthony would be booked into a psychiatric hospital. But then 2 days later, on the 17th of November 1972, Anthony did end up murdering his mother, and he ended up stabbing Barbara in the kitchen. And at the time, Barbara was preparing food for a dinner that she had organized with friends. And one of her friends did end up arriving at the house, and they noticed Barbara, and obviously she called police. The police came and they arrested Anthony. Barbara was only 51 at the time that she was murdered, and Anthony was 25. And when police did arrive at the house, Anthony did confess to everything, and he was charged with Barbara's murder. And Anthony was institutionalized at Broadmoor Hospital, and this was until the 21st of July 1980. Anthony's friends really believed that he was not guilty, and they kept on pushing for him to be released, which he was. So when Anthony was 33, he then was released, and he flew to his grandmother's house to stay with her. And this was back in New York City. And at this time, his grandmother was now 87 years old. And remember, her name was Nina. So on July 27th, only 6 days after being released, he then attacked his grandmother. He broke several of her bones, stabbed her, and just badly beat her. And he did end up being arrested by the New York Police Department. And Anthony was sent to Rikers Island prison. And after around 8 months of him staying at Rikers Island, he was assessed by a psychiatrist. And Anthony was actually expected to be released on bail in 1981. However, because he used to live in the UK for a while. The trial was eventually delayed because the medical records had taken quite a while to come from the UK. And Anthony seemed very upset by this. And on March 20th, 1981, at 3:30, he was sent back to his cell to wait for the medical records to come back. And Anthony was actually found dead in his cell 30 minutes later, which ironically he was suffocated by a plastic bag. And if you remember right at the beginning, his grandfather was one of the first people to create plastic. So that was a very tragic case of the Bakerlands. It was quite a hectic story. I actually don't know who the victims are and who the accused are. Let me know what you think below, who you think the actual victims were. Obviously, Barbara was a victim and she had some issues, but there were a lot of things that were quite questionable that she did in her life, as well as Brooke and Anthony too. So let me know what you think of it down below. I hope that you were entertained by this one. Don't forget to stay safe, and I'll see you again next Sunday. Bye.